Okay, if you missed it, just a couple of minutes ago, I said that this morning we're going to switch gears a little bit. The last few weeks we've been looking at arguments for the existence of God. First cause argument, design argument, the moral argument, the one that I specialize in. But before we move on to the next topic, we want to spend 1 week discussing the most popular argument against the existence of God. And that is referred to as the problem of evil. So this morning we're going to look at the problem of evil and then some responses that have been developed to push back against this argument that there is no God. Now I will say before we get started that this can be a sensitive topic. The problem of evil and suffering in the world hits us pretty hard, especially when we're in the midst of suffering ourselves. So we don't want to take it lightly. This is something that, even though I don't think shows that there is no God, it certainly is something that we all struggle with. Even committed, faithful Christians struggle with this issue. So we don't want to make light of it. We just don't want to brush it off. I want to start with a video of a young man who is struggling with this issue, just to show that this can be a difficult topic. Why would God allow evil and suffering in this world? It seems we all struggle with this issue from time to time. So maybe you'll relate to the young man in this video. Take a look.
I see in my mom and my dad people who I look at as Christians, real Christians who have a love for God. I see this spark in them. I just wonder sometimes about myself why I don't have that. Christianity, Jesus, and all that stuff, spending my life since I can never remember. So it makes me question whether it's my faith sometimes, or whether it's my parents' faith. If it's just something our society grows up with, and it's just part of our culture. I've been questioning God's existence probably since I was 12. The thing that made me question God the most was living in a suburban area where Christianity is the main religion. I'm seeing a lot of poverty, a lot of pretty heartbreaking stuff. You get a place like Africa and you see everyone's lives is like this. It's not, 1 out of 30. It's everyone. And it's like, did God forsaken this place? Does he just not care about these people? It's almost like God just forgot about it. I don't know why God allows suffering. I wrestle with that a lot, but I do blame him per se for not doing anything about it. I don't understand how you can sit back and have all this power and watch people suffer so greatly. It's hard to believe that if you had the power to stop it, you wouldn't. I look at it as, if there was a God, he wouldn't allow this suffering, so because there is suffering, there is no God, or because there is no God, there's suffering. I do question what will happen when I die, whether I just no longer there, or if there is an eternity. I really hope there is an eternity.
One thing I appreciate about that video and about that young man is his honesty as he's wrestling through this issue. And I think that's the sort of environment, the sort of atmosphere that we want to create, is a place where people can discuss what they're thinking and the concerns that they have. And so in all the apologetics ministry and local church ministry that I've done, I've really tried to encourage, especially young people, to vocalize what they're thinking, what their thought processes are. And sometimes that freaks parents out, or that scares people. But I think it's healthy to wrestle through these doubts and questions. As a young person, I didn't do that, and I regret it. I was one of those who was ashamed to talk about my doubts and questions. I thought I was the only person who had such doubts and questions. And so it put me in a bad place, like most young people. I thought I was the only one in the world going through something like that. But it's best to talk about it. And so I encourage you then as the adults too, to make sure we're creating an atmosphere where people can talk about these things and the doubts and concerns that they're having, and not just jump on them immediately, but let them process through that and give them good resources as they work through it. I think it's an encouraging thing, honestly, most of the time, when people are having these questions and doubts, because it means that they're taking their faith seriously. They're coming to realize that Christianity just isn't about guitars and pizza. It's asking for their entire life. And they want to take that seriously and make sure it's true before they give Jesus their entire life. So I think it's good for young people to process and think through these issues and work through their concerns and even doubts and questions. The other caveat that I would say before we jump into this topic is there's a right time and there's a wrong time to discuss the problem of evil. As I've said before, us apologists tend to have a bad reputation for just jumping into argumentation. We're very analytical and think in analytical ways like engineers, computer programmers, mathematicians. And so we just want to jump to the answer immediately and lay out all these sophisticated arguments. But oftentimes, especially when people are in the midst of pain and suffering, that's not really what they need. In those situations, the person probably just needs a good friend and needs somebody to cry with and struggle with and needs a hug from. So we don't want to come in with all the answers. If a friend of ours is struggling with the problem of evil, if they're in the midst of pain and suffering themselves, we want to come in as a good friend and admit that we often don't know why God allows certain things to happen, and pray with them and love on them. However, I think there are appropriate times, maybe when the emotions aren't as high, to step back from the individual situations that we find ourselves in and think about it, try to think about it a bit more objectively. And hopefully we can do that this morning. Think about evil and suffering and why God might allow this to happen in our world. Now, there are two, as I said before, there are two versions of the problem of evil: the logical version and the probability version. And we're going to work through both of them this morning and provide responses to them. Again, these are arguments against the existence of God, and so we want to understand what people are thinking and saying through these arguments, and then how to respond to them. And why I would say we shouldn't conclude from these arguments that there is no God. I don't think they make that case. Now, as we've been building a case for the existence of God, we've also developed a list of attributes that God is like. I think these are reasonable attributes to conclude that God is like this. And in fact, most theists throughout history and around the world have come to very similar conclusions about what God is like. All the way back to Aristotle, Plato, other belief systems, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, even a lot of the polytheistic belief systems usually will have some sort of an ultimate being with these characteristics. And it makes sense because these independent thinkers around the world and throughout history came to this conclusion, similar conclusions, through a similar thought process. And it is the arguments that we've been studying. That's why you can find those arguments all around the world throughout history as people were observing the world around them and coming to these reasonable conclusions about there must be an ultimate being and he must be like this, have these attributes. However, it wasn't very long, and this happens in most all theistic belief systems, that as people start looking at these various characteristics of God, something seems to jump out to them. If you look at it, right, we've got this ultimate being who is powerful. Some would say all-powerful, right? Omnipotent, omnipotent, can do all things, all-powerful. But this ultimate being, God, if we want to use that term, is also all good, morally perfect. That seems to raise an issue. If we have this God, this ultimate supreme being who is all-powerful and all good, then why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? That seems odd. That seems like something that you wouldn't expect if there's an all-powerful, all-good God who is ruling over the universe. Why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And people have been so bothered by this issue that some of them have concluded that there must not be a God, at least not a God like this, because there's so much evil and suffering in the world. As I said, this is the most popular argument against God. This is probably the most powerful argument against God. Most of the atheists that I debate, go up against, are usually atheists because, as they would say, because of the problem of evil. We also see this in a lot of our popular media. I was very interested to see this problem of evil argument against God pop up in a recent movie, Batman v Superman. I don't know if you enjoy the DC movies, or maybe you're more of a Marvel fan, but in the Batman v Superman movie, the writers, directors of that movie put the problem of evil against God in the mouth of the villain, Lex Luthor, which I thought was very interesting. I enjoy movies, I love watching movies, but I'm always interested to try to figure out what the writers and directors, what kind of messages that they're trying to communicate through their movies. And so to put the problem of evil in the mouth of a villain, I thought was a very interesting move. But regardless, here's what Lex Luthor says in that movie. At the beginning of the quote, he's talking about Superman, of course, but you'll see very quickly he jumps from Superman to God and summarizes, well, I would say, the problem of evil. Take a look at this quote from the movie, Batman v Superman. Lex Luthor said, "The problem of evil in the world, the problem of absolute virtue, the problem of you," talking to Superman, "on top of everything else, you above all, because that's what God is. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from daddy's fists and abominations. I figured out way back that if God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful." To put it in a little bit more formalized way, oftentimes, at least the logical problem of evil will start out like this. Somebody will say, there seems to be a logical contradiction among these three statements. The idea that God is all powerful, the idea that God is all good, and the fact that evil and suffering exists in our world. The bottom line is, similar to what Lex Luthor says, if God is all powerful and all good, then why doesn't he stop the evil and suffering in the world? Either he can't, then he's not all powerful, or he won't, meaning that he is not all good. So this is the problem in a nutshell. There seems to be a contradiction here. So let me summarize for you this morning the most common strategy that theists have taken, and this isn't new, this goes back just as far back as the problem of evil itself. So thousands of years, people have been presenting a free will defense, is what it's called. So the most common strategy to the logical problem of evil is to present a free will defense, a free will scenario. So let me explain how this strategy works. Basically, the logical problem of evil is saying that it's impossible for all three of these things to be true at the same time. There's some sort of logical contradiction here. So this is impossible. In order to combat an impossibility claim, all a person needs to do is to present a possible scenario in which all three of these things are true. Now, be careful here. It doesn't have to be the actual scenario, so we don't have to claim that we know exactly why God allows evil and suffering. All we have to do is present a possible scenario as to how or why God would allow evil, and all these three things can be true at the same time. If we can present a possible scenario, we've defeated their impossibility claim, if that makes sense. Now we can go further and maybe speculate more and even refer to special revelation to learn more about the problem of evil and why God might allow evil and suffering. But to combat this logical problem of evil, all we needed to do is present a possible scenario where these three things are in fact true. And that proves that there's no logical contradiction here. Now, as I said, the most famous of these possible scenarios is called the free will defense. And the free will defense has been around for a long time, but the most well-known contemporary proponent of a free will defense is a Christian philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga. Now, you've probably heard me mention that name before, and I want to show you a quick video about Alvin Plantinga. And it doesn't talk much about his free will defense in this video. It's just more of a biography. It's just a couple minutes long, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, about Alvin Plantinga. But it's important that you're aware of him because he has really been at the forefront of a Christian renaissance within philosophy. As the video will explain, if you go back 50, 60, 70 years, theism and Christianity was pretty much dead within academia, especially within academic philosophy. But because of people like Alvin Plantinga and others, there has been a huge resurgence of good, solid Christian philosophy. And that's one of the things that led me into studying philosophy and being a part of this movement. It's been a very exciting renaissance of Christian philosophy, to the point now where you've got a tremendous amount of Christians who are professional academic philosophers at the highest level. Some of them I've told you about before. But take a look at this video and Alvin Plantinga, just a little biography about him and his life, so you're familiar more with him. Okay, so let's take a look at specifically Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. What he proposed, again, is just a possible scenario which would show, if this is even possible, then there isn't a logical contradiction in those three statements. So here's his possible scenario he presented. He said, what if it's the case that in any possible universe that God could create with free creatures, free human beings, that they would always choose some evil? This is a term, the term for this has come to be trans-world depravity. You've probably heard of the term total depravity before, just meaning the fact that as human beings, we are totally depraved. Our entire human nature has been corrupted by sin and evil. Well, this idea, trans-world depravity, is even worse than that, because it basically says that it might be the case that in any universe God would create with free human beings in it, human beings who had free will, that we would always choose some evil. It might be the case that we are just that bad. We are trans-world depraved. Now, God, being omnipotent, could obviously force us to do good things, right? I mean, God can force us to do, He has the power to force us to do anything, right? He's omnipotent. However, if He forced us to do good things, we would be more like puppets, right? Or robots. And so it would be hard to think in a scenario like that there would be any real, true moral goodness, because we'd just be puppets that God was forcing to do certain things. We wouldn't be choosing to do those good things on our own. And so it might be the case that God chose to create creatures, human beings with free will, to allow the possibility for true moral goodness, for humans to choose to do good things, knowing that they would sometimes use that freedom to choose evil. So basically, he's presenting here a possible scenario where all three of these things could be true, and thus there's no contradiction. So here's a quote from Plantinga himself. He said, "It's possible that God, even being all-powerful, could not create a universe with," this is the key, "free creatures who never choose evil." He could force them, right, to always choose good, but then they wouldn't be free. Furthermore, it's possible, again, he's not necessarily, this is the actual scenario, this is just a possibility. It's possible that God, even being all good, would desire to create a universe which contains evil if moral goodness requires free moral creatures. Again, it's not that free will is a good thing in and of itself, it's that free will is necessary for there to be true moral goodness, because somebody has to choose that freely for that to be really truly good. If they're forced to do it, that wouldn't be moral goodness, true moral goodness. So here's kind of an easy way to think about it. Take a look at these options. So if Plantinga's possible scenario is what happened, then God faced a choice between these three options. If trans-world depravity is true, if in any universe he created, us free human beings with free will would always choose some evil, then God had to choose between these three options. Option one, just don't create anything, right? Certainly that would be an option. Number two, create a universe where he forces everybody to always choose the right thing, but then that wouldn't be true moral goodness. We'd just be puppets or robots. Or the third option would be to create a universe with human beings that have free will. This allows for true moral goodness, but it also opens the door for evil and suffering. And if in fact we are trans-world depraved, if we're just that bad that in any universe where God gives us free will, we always choose some evil, then these were really the only three options available to God. And it seems reasonable that he would choose number three. Even though there would be some evil in it and some suffering as a result of our evil choices, it would also involve some moral goodness. Now, even within option three, we could go a little bit further than this. Even within option three, there'd be a lot of scenarios how things could play out, right? So even within option three, there would be, I don't know how many different scenarios God could orchestrate circumstances, even granting us free will, but orchestrating circumstances, right, on what we could do with our free will and how much damage we could cause with our free will. So even within option three, there's a lot of, there's always going to be some evil and suffering, but there are ways that God could orchestrate it differently within option three. So it might be the case that within option three, of all of the ways that things could play out within option three, that God chose the one that minimized the evil and suffering in the world, or that maximized the moral goodness. Maybe he had two goals: minimize suffering and maximize moral goodness. And so that is possibly the option he chose within option three. But we don't need to go any further than this, because just this alone points out that there isn't a contradiction here. If trans-world depravity is in fact true, then we've presented a possible scenario where all three of these things would be true, thus proving there's no contradiction here. Now, Plantinga, like I said, is just the most contemporary, recent, well-known proponent of this free will defense. It goes back centuries, but it's good to be familiar with the person who's most well known for it lately. I'm going to show you a video that summarizes this logical problem of evil before we move on to the probability version. But I will say that the vast majority of people, both atheists and theists, believe that Plantinga has fairly well defeated the logical problem of evil. You just don't see the logical problem of evil come up as much anymore because Plantinga did such a great job making this free will defense. It still does come up a bit. In my debate coming up at UNL in April, I'm debating an atheist philosophy professor from Notre Dame, by the way, where Plantinga ended his career. He's coming down from Indiana to debate me at UNL. And part of the reason he's an atheist, he makes a case against God using the logical problem of evil. So that's going to be part of my debate with him. That issue will come up in the debate. But take a look at this video and then we'll move on to the probability version of the problem of evil. Okay, so let's move on then to that probability version of the problem of evil. Now this one's a little bit more difficult to defeat because it's not making as strong of a claim, right? Think about it for a moment. When somebody makes a very strong claim, that tends to be easier to defeat than somebody who makes a more maybe nuanced, softer claim, okay? So the logical problem of evil, that is a very large claim that there is a logical contradiction, right? And in order to defeat that, all you have to present, as we've talked about, is a possible scenario where all those things are true. It doesn't have to be the actual scenario, just a possible scenario. And that defeats that very strong claim that it's impossible for God to exist. The probability version doesn't say that it's impossible for God to exist. It simply says that it's not likely that God exists. That's why it's called the probability version. It's basically saying that because of the evil and suffering in the world, it's most probable that there is no God. So it's not making an absolute impossibility claim, it's making a softer claim, a probability claim, which is actually more difficult to defeat. Okay, let me talk a little bit to set this up. Let's talk about a hypothetical scenario. And I think this will help you understand why it's called a probability version of the problem of evil. Let's pretend that we all decide to move to a new city together. All right, we're done with Lincoln for whatever reason. Football team is just not getting any better, so we're going to take off. We're moving to a new city, right? Where do you guys want to move to? Somebody said Florida? All right, what city in Florida? Orlando, Florida. All right, we're all moving to Orlando. And we're super excited because we've heard that Superman actually lives in Orlando now. So everybody there tells us, hey, you made a good decision. Come down here to Orlando. There's no crime. There's no pain, there's no suffering, there's no evil, there's no bad guys, because Superman is here and he takes care of us, right? He comes in and he swoops in and saves the day, so there's no problems here in Orlando whatsoever. Come on down. So we're super pumped. We moved down to Orlando. We lived there, and the first week we're there, our apartment gets broken into and everything, all of our belongings are stolen. Our car gets jacked, and we get mugged on the street the very first week. And we're like, what in the world? What's going on here? We thought Orlando was going to be such a great place because Superman would swoop in and always save the day. And let's say we continue to live there, even though all those bad things happened to us the first week. We continue to stay there, and maybe we live there for a few years, and we just keep seeing bad things happen on the news to other people, and bad things continue happening to us, and we never see Superman at all. And years go by, and there's no Superman. We never hear of him, we never see him, and eventually we might start to wonder, well, Where is he then? It's not impossible, right, for Superman to exist, but it just doesn't seem likely that he's at least here in Orlando, because all these bad things keep happening. And so we might conclude, not that we know with absolute certainty that Superman isn't there. Maybe he's tied up with kryptonite somewhere. Maybe Lex Luthor has him tied up with kryptonite somewhere. So we're not saying it's impossible for Superman to be here. It just seems pretty unlikely, considering all these bad things are happening and he never swoops in to save the day. And that's kind of what the probability version of the problem of evil is getting at. Those who make this argument aren't saying that it's impossible for God to exist. It just seems rather unlikely, considering that there's all this evil and suffering in our world. And that's why it's called the probability version. As I said, it's more difficult to defeat because it's not as strong of a claim. What I want to do is kind of walk you through how this conversation is played out, okay? And this is, I'm going to summarize hundreds of years of discussion over this issue. But honestly, this is often how the conversation plays out when a theist, a Christian, and an atheist have this conversation. So it's not only summarizing hundreds of years of people writing and thinking of this issue, it also summarizes, I think, well, just a 15-20 minute conversation, how it usually goes between a well-informed Christian and a well-informed atheist on this issue. So this is usually the flow of the discussion. This is how it usually goes back and forth. So it'll start, right, with the atheist making the probability version of the problem of evil. And they're saying, look, I don't think that there is a God. I don't know with absolute certainty that there's no God. That's not the claim that they're making. They're just saying there probably isn't a God because of all of this evil and suffering in the world. And so I'm concluding, the atheist, that there is no God because of this. The most common response on the theistic side then is to present some sort of greater good theodicy. And that kind of came up in that first video. Did you notice that? The dentist drill always catches my attention. Gives me goosebumps every time I hear that noise, even in that video, right? But that's a good example, because a greater good theodicy basically says, well, God allows evil in order to accomplish some greater good. So for example, maybe if I'm my child, let me step back for a second. Would you ever let somebody cut your child with a knife? You might say, well, no, I would never allow that to happen. Well, actually, you might. If they had appendicitis, if their appendix burst, you would allow a surgeon to take a knife, a scalpel, and cut your child open in order to accomplish a greater good, to remove the appendix. And we have all sorts of surgeries, right, that we go through that aren't fun. Going to the dentist is not usually fun, right? Sorry for all the dentists in the crowd. But we do those things, even though they're painful and involve some suffering, because they lead to a greater good. And so the most common response to the probability version of evil is some sort of greater good theodicy. That, look, hey, even though we might not know all of the greater good that God is bringing out of the evil and suffering that He allows, that's why we think God is allowing it, because He brings about a greater good from that evil, or prevents a worse situation of evil and suffering. So either He's preventing a worse evil, or He's bringing about a greater good from the evil that He allows. So that's the most common strategy to the probability version of the problem of evil. So how does the atheist come back? How does the atheist respond then to that? Well, the main objection to a greater good theodicy is to argue that there seems to be some evil that serves no purpose. So the atheist side would win if the Christian or the theistic side is making a greater good theodicy. The atheist would win or defeat that if they could show that there's some evil which doesn't result in a greater good. Okay? In other words, evil that is purposeless, that serves no purpose. The reason the atheist would win in this situation is because the theist on the other side is claiming that every evil has a purpose. God brings about a greater good. Going to the dentist, surgery, there's always a greater good that comes from the suffering and evil that God allows. So the atheist is pushing back now, and they're saying, come on, really? Certainly there's some evil that serves no purpose. And they'll bring up, horrendous situations that do happen. Little children being murdered in ghastly ways. One of the most common examples in this conversation is to talk about a baby deer dying in a forest fire. And the atheist would say, what greater good could ever come from that terrible suffering that poor little baby deer experienced in a forest fire? How could there be any greater good that would come from that? So that is how the argument, that's how the back and forth usually goes. The atheist is going to be saying something like this. This is the purposeless evil objection to a greater good theodicy. They would say, look, God's not going to allow purposeless evil. Evil that serves no purpose, brings about no greater good, if he's all good and all powerful. But certainly some evil has no purpose. Therefore, God probably doesn't exist. Again, they're not saying it's impossible for God to exist. They're just saying it's not very probable. So in order for the atheist's objection to work, they have to argue that some evil serves no purpose. And they try to bring up examples and kind of forces us into a corner to try to ask of us what possible purpose could such and such evil accomplish. Baby deer dying in a fire, etc., etc. Now, the way for us to respond to that, again, this is back and forth, this is how the conversation usually always goes, is to challenge this, right? Challenge the idea that there is purposeless evil. So basically, we're going at premise 2 in their argument. So the most common way that the theist then pushes back against this is to argue against premise 2. To argue that no, in fact, all evil and suffering does accomplish a greater good, some sort of purpose. Now, we don't have to claim that we know what the greater good is. So we can work ourselves out of that corner, right, that the atheist is trying to force us in by coming up with the greater good or the purpose for every single evil. We can easily just say, look, we don't know what the purpose is for all the instances of evil and suffering in the world. We just think that there is ultimately going to be a greater good that comes as a result. Even though we don't know what it is, that does not mean there isn't one. So here are some ways, just in a friendly conversation, that you can push back against their purposeless evil objection. You could say things like this. How could you know that some evil has no purpose? It seems very, very difficult for us as finite creatures to know all the ripple effects and all the consequences that different actions could have. And so for us to adamantly claim that there is an instance of evil and suffering that accomplishes no good, no greater good whatsoever, that seems like a very high bar, very difficult for somebody to prove that. And we could also point out the fact that this life is not the end of the story. So even for that baby deer, right, we don't know what the afterlife holds for animals, humans, obviously. And so usually the atheist is thinking of this life alone. But if Christianity is true, then there's a whole afterlife to consider in which greater good benefits might come as a result of evil and suffering that we're unaware of in this life only. So you can't limit it to just this life. So this is some ways to push back against their purposeless evil objection. All right, now I think this is a pretty strong reply against the purposeless evil objection. Okay, so if you go back to the conversation, right? I think this fourth point, right, for the conversation, we follow it down to number 4. I think this is a very strong response to number 3, okay? So I think number 4 is a very strong response to number 3. However, I'm going to go back even earlier and say that I'm probably not the biggest fan of Greater Good Theodicies. So when I'm in this conversation, even though Greater Good Theodicies is the most common strategy here, it's not a strategy that I take. There are other theodicies out there besides the Greater Good Theodicy, and I've actually tried to work on developing a theodicy of my own, which I'll share a little bit with you this morning, but it's not fully complete yet. It's something that I want to write out and think more about, but I'm in the process of developing my own theodicy. And there's just several reasons why I'm not a fan of the Greater Good Theodicy. So it's not the strategy that I would take, even though that's the most common strategy. One of the reasons why I don't like the Greater Good Theodicy is that it seems to put God in a difficult situation. It seems to indicate that somehow God needs evil in order to bring about certain goods. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't really care for the Greater Good Theodicy. Can God bring good out of evil? Well, of course he can. Does he? Yes, certainly. But I'm not sure if that's the actual reason why he allows evil and suffering. So I think God does bring about greater good from evil and suffering quite often, but I have my doubts as to whether that's the main reason that he allows it. Okay, so there's other theodicies out there. Maybe some of them you've heard of. There's soul-making theodicies, which is kind of like a greater good, maybe just a little bit of a twist on the Greater Good Theodicy. There's natural law theodicies, created order theodicy. There's this would be more of a Calvinistic, Reformed response. Jonathan Edwards, God's glory theodicy, you could call it. So the Greater Good Theodicy isn't the only response out there. Okay, I just want you to be aware that there are other theodicies. And at the time we have left, so I'm looking at the time, we're right at about 10 o'clock, right? Which means I've got 7 minutes to summarize with you the theodicy that I'm developing. So I'm going to use a theodicy, a response to the probability version of the problem of evil, in my upcoming debate with an atheist philosophy professor from Notre Dame. That debate is in April, and it's just one portion of the debate. That's not what the main debate is about, but it does come up. And so I'm going to summarize my Divine Love Theodicy in that debate. So I thought it might be good just to run it by you guys, maybe see what you think. Maybe you can give me some feedback on this theodicy. Now it's going to be, you're going to find that it's familiar because I'm picking up a lot on Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, but I'm putting my own twist on it, my own twist when it comes to my divine love theory. Okay, so let me set the stage a little bit here. If you're familiar at all with my divine love theory, my book and describing where moral goodness and evil ultimately comes from. It's a Trinitarian theory. So I argue in my book, Divine Love Theory, that the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity is the ultimate source and foundation of morality. And I'll piggyback off of that and say, look, it seems as though loving relationships are the ultimate good. Why would I say that? It seems as though God himself exists as three persons that have loving relationships with each other, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So when I say that loving relationships are the ultimate good, I'm basically just saying that God is the ultimate good. And the moral goodness of God consists really of those loving relationships between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as I understand it from Scripture, God created us to join that fellowship, to join that loving fellowship. A lot of this comes from John 17, if you want scriptural references. So a lot of my theory is based on John 17 and how God created us to be persons, not divine persons, but human persons, to expand the loving communion of the Trinity, to join that loving communion. So we were created for loving relationships, both with God and with others. And that's why I think Jesus said the greatest commands are to love God and to love others. And all the other moral commandments are based on those two primary ones. Because I think that's what we were created for. We were created for loving relationships with God and with others. And so that's how I begin my Divine Love Theodicy. So I don't have to be on the hook to say that there is a purpose for every evil. Now I lean towards that. I lean towards the idea that God could work out a greater good from every evil that he allows, because it seems like he could do that, and it seems like he probably would do that. But the point I'm getting at is that it doesn't seem that that's the reason why he allows evil and suffering in the first place. Even though he could bring about greater good from it, I don't think that's the purpose he allows evil in the first place. So why did he allow evil in the first place? Well, again, this is similar to Plantinga's free will defense. Because I would say that for God to create human beings that resembled him, created in his image, to join the loving relationships of the Trinity, in order to create us that way, he had to give us free will. So free will is necessary for those loving relationships. Right? God, again, just like with Plantinga's free will defense, God could force us to love him, force us to love others, but that really wouldn't seem like true love, right? That would seem like we're more puppets. I mean, you don't want a girlfriend, a boyfriend, you don't want to marry somebody who's forced to love you. You want to be in a loving relationship with somebody who chooses to love you. And so it seems that free will is necessary then to have these loving relationships. It's not that the free will is great in and of itself, but it's necessary in order for there to be true loving relationships. So if God was going to create us and want us to image him and be involved in loving relationships with him and with others, it seems that he would have to give us free will. But if he opens up the door, right, for free will, just like with Plantinga's free will defense, that opens up the door for there to be evil, which I would say is just the opposite of love. So, similar to Plantinga's free will defense, if my Divine Love Theodicy is correct, then God would be faced with having to choose between these three options. Okay? If God wanted to create a world where human beings could reflect him, image him, and enjoy loving relationships, I think that's the reason, that's the purpose we were created. That's the purpose of life, is loving relationships. So if God was going to create humans with that free will, then it seems like these are the three options he was faced with. First, just don't create anything. It's always an option. Number 2, create a universe where humans are forced to love, robots, puppets, but there's no freedom there, and so there's probably couldn't consider that true loving relationships. Or the third option, create a universe with freedom, humans with free will, which then allows for true loving relationships, knowing that some would always choose evil. Again, piggybacking off of Plantinga's trans world depravity, the fact that we're just so evil, in any universe God would put us in, we would always choose evil, at least sometimes. So it seems reasonable to me if God was faced with these 3 options, that he would choose the third one, even though he knew it would include some evil and suffering. So with my Divine Love Theodicy, you don't have to maintain that there is a purpose to every evil. You don't have to maintain that out of every evil there comes a greater good. You could say, look, there might be some evil that doesn't lead to a greater good itself. But that's not the reason why God is allowing evil and suffering in the first place. The reason that God is allowing evil and suffering is so that there could be true loving relationships. Now it might be, and this is where I have to go a little bit further in my Divine Love Theodicy, it might be, just as we've discussed before, that within option 3, there's a lot of different ways that the universe could play out in option 3. So it might be the case that God minimized the pain and suffering, right? So of all the infinite, maybe not infinite, but of all the ways that circumstances could play out within option 3, he would choose the timeline that had the least amount of evil and suffering in it. Or, and this is the next point that I want to work on in my Divine Love Theodicy, it might not be that his only goal was to minimize evil and suffering. He might have had an alternative or an additional goal to maximize loving relationships. So even within option 3, he might have chosen, of all the possibilities within option 3, he might have chosen the one that maximizes the quality and quantity of loving relationships for a certain amount of evil and suffering. So that's how I'm working on my Divine Love Theodicy. But I'm hoping to put it into a paper and get it published. I don't know if it's big enough to work into a book eventually, but it's something I would like to present it at a paper, as a paper, and it's definitely coming up in the debate at UNL in April. So let me close with this video. Again, it's about 7-8 minutes, and it's summarizing the probability version of the problem of evil. And after the video, the class will be done.